But we'll start today. We're doing a lesson on moons of the solar system. So we'll start with our moon and then we'll go to other planets' moons. So first, I have a question for you guys. What do you already know about moons? I know like we have a moon, but is there anything else you know that you'd like to share with us or something you'd like to learn? Um, well, I guess I'll continue because moons are actually, yeah. So let's look at our moon. So moons orbit around around planets. And if you look at our moon, for example, it orbits around the Earth, meaning it moves in a circular path around a planet, or in this case, the Earth. And our moon orbits once every month, which is actually where the term month comes from. You can see that the word moon that's kind of in the word month. And that's where that word comes from, actually, which is pretty interesting. A month is actually around 28. I mean, the time it takes for the moon to go around Earth takes around 28 days. However, back when they created the months and the years of the calendar, they didn't quite know and they approximated to 30 or 31 days. Can you please mute if you're not talking? Thank you. So we'll start with moon phases. Basically, when you look at the moon, it's not always a full moon, and it can come in a variety of shapes depending on where it is in our orbit around the sun, around the Earth, I mean. If you look in this diagram right over here, um, the one half of the moon is always illuminated, but we can't always see that half that's illuminated if we're looking from the Earth. So the circle of the Earth. Welcome everyone that just joined. We just started basically. So to learn about moon phases, basically, a full moon happens when the moon is behind the Earth almost, and the full half of the moon that's illuminated by the sun can be seen by the Earth. Whereas a new moon is where the moon is completely dark, not visible, because the half that's lit up is facing away from the Earth. And then as you can see, all of the different shapes like the crescents and half moons are just stages in between as the moon orbits around the Earth. And as you can see in the bottom here, these are all the phases and their shapes and the names of the phases. So it starts with a new moon, then goes to the waxing crescent, first quarter, which is also a half moon, and then waxing gibbous, full moon, waning gibbous, third quarter, and then finally waning crescent. And these all happen, these repeat every single month, basically, as every single time the moon goes around the Earth, it repeats. And that's why sometimes when you look at the moon, sometimes it's full, sometimes it might be a half moon, or sometimes you just don't see any moon because it's a new moon. Does anyone have any questions about that? Or okay, we'll move on. So something interesting can happen since the moon goes around the Earth. It can sometimes go in between the Earth and the sun, or the Earth can fall in between the moon and the sun. And when this happens, it's called an eclipse. So there's two different types of eclipses. There's solar eclipses and lunar eclipses. You might have heard of the solar eclipses. They're more famous because the sky just turns dark during the middle of the day since the moon goes in front of the sun, as you can see in the image on the bottom. And you can see the sun's atmosphere during a solar eclipse. As you can see in the diagram, if the moon is in between the sun and the Earth, the moon casts a shadow on the Earth, meaning sunlight does not reach that point on the Earth. And in this case, it's considered a solar eclipse. A lunar eclipse is the opposite, and that's when the moon is, and the Earth is in between the sun and the moon. And a lunar eclipse is not dark as you would think, but actually red because light bends around the Earth's atmosphere and onto the moon. And in the same way a sunset or sunrise is reddish, it bends that light onto the moon, making the moon red during a lunar eclipse. And lunar eclipses are not that rare. They actually happen 1 or 2 times a year. In fact, one happened not too long ago. One happened like 2 weeks ago almost for half the world in like North America, South America, and a bit of Europe and Africa. So you might have seen that. But those are lunar and solar eclipses. Solar eclipses are a lot more rare, but they're also a lot more interesting to see because as the sun goes in front of, as the moon goes in front of the sun, the sky gets darker and darker, and then suddenly the stars come out in the middle of the day, which is always an incredible experience if it happens. We'll talk about other moons too, because our moon is not the only moon in our solar system, even though it's the one we know best. So actually, in fact, all planets and even some dwarf planets and asteroids have moons, totaling up to around 200 moons in our solar system. Although most of these moons are concentrated around the bigger planets like Jupiter and Saturn, with Jupiter having over 70 moons. As you can see in this picture, these just show the biggest moons in our solar system and show Jupiter's 4 big moons called the Galilean moons and Earth's moon, and then the size of Earth to scale. There's also some, so as you can see, Ganymede here, Jupiter's moon, is the biggest moon in the solar system, actually, bigger than even the planet Mercury. And we'll go more into those moons later along the lecture. But basically, there's many more moons in our solar system than just our moon. And the moon just goes around its host planet or host asteroid, and that's what makes it a moon. It's a natural satellite. Does anyone have any questions about that? If you can raise your hand if you have a question, and then no one has a question, we'll continue. So we'll go more into the Galilean moons in this today, because the Galilean moons are the most interesting moons in our solar system, and they're Jupiter's 4 biggest moons, and they each have their own qualities. As you can see, the site Jupiter is very big, like over 1,000 Earths could fit inside of Jupiter. And you can see the 4 Galilean moons to scale. These go around the planet Jupiter. As you can see in this diagram, all of them orbit around different distances from Jupiter, with Callisto orbiting the furthest away and Io orbiting the closest to Jupiter. And these moons were actually discovered in 1610 by Galileo, who created the first telescope and used that to figure out, he looked at Jupiter and then saw there was these dots that moved around Jupiter day after day, and later determined that these were actually moons orbiting around Jupiter. And it was in fact the first moons that were ever discovered apart from Earth's moon in the solar system, which is very interesting. So Io is Jupiter's innermost moon. Io is Jupiter's innermost moon, and it's very interesting because of the volcanoes that are present on Io. As you can see in this picture, you can see there's a slightly blue like eruption coming out of Io, and that's actually a volcano. The other patterns you see on the moon are volcanic basins, which are just lava that have slowly cooled down and dried across large parts of the moon. Io has over 400 volcanoes, many of them active at once, and that makes it the most geologically active body in our solar system, which is very crazy. There's some other planets, there's like, for example, Venus also has a lot of volcanoes, but it's nowhere close to how many this moon Io has.
Honey, I don't have lights. You even know she's a person.
Good question, or can you please mute if you don't?
Right. It's for what?
Okay. So that's Io, and Io is the one that orbits closest to Jupiter. Since it orbits closest to Jupiter, Jupiter's gravity is constantly pulling on Io, which heats up the planet and creates these lava and these volcanoes and makes it in general much warmer than it should usually be. Io is composed mostly of rock, but it has an molten iron core at its center and is about the size of Earth's moon for comparison. Then we have Europa, and Europa is one of the most famous moons in our solar system because there's actually liquid water right below its surface, which is very interesting because we all know life really likes liquid water, and if that exists somewhere outside of Earth, it means that there could potentially be life, and it'd be the most likely place we could find life in our solar system outside of the Earth. Since Europa is also very close to Jupiter, it also experiences this gravitational tugging, which creates these crisscross lines across the moon, as you can see in this picture. And the surface is actually ice, and right below the surface is actually 100 kilometers deep of water, in which we actually don't know anything about until we eventually send solar systems and probes to it. Hannah, did you have a question? If you can unmute and ask, you're raising your hand. Okay, well, yeah.
I have a question.
Yeah,
Sorry.
what's your
My
question?
question is, what moon is Europa?
Europa is one of Jupiter's moons. So Jupiter has 4 big moons and like maybe 60 other smaller moons, and Europa is one of the planet Jupiter's
I
moons.
have a question.
Yeah.
Please, can you name the moons?
Is what?
Can you name the moons that are in Jupiter?
How do you name the moons?
Can you name the moons that are in Jupiter?
Astronomers, can you please not draw on the thing, but astronomers named the moons like 200, 300 years ago when they were first discovered. Europa was discovered 400 years ago and was named by Galileo.
And they are just changing topic fast.
Okay, can you please mute?
Thank you.
Mhm.
Yeah, thank you.
So next is Ganymede, and Ganymede is actually the biggest moon in our solar system. It's also one of Jupiter's. Oh, I see. There's one question in the chat about all this data, and this data was, especially the pictures, were taken by spaceships that traveled to these planets and these moons and took pictures, because our telescopes aren't good enough to take these good pictures, but they can tell there's a moon and they can look at the moons, but these high quality color pictures are taken by spaceships that we've sent to the moons and the planets. So Ganymede is the largest moon, 5,000 kilometers across, and even bigger than the planet Mercury that we learned about last week in our planet course. So due to the size of Ganymede, it's actually the only known moon that could have a magnetic field, which is just, it acts as if a big magnet, basically, that filters out radiation and ionized particles and basically protects the moon from Jupiter and the sun. Ganymede is, apart from that, as you can see, there's many craters on Ganymede. If you can see, Ganymede is not anywhere close to the size of the sun. It's actually pretty small in comparison to to the sun and to planets, but it's about the size of Mercury, which is maybe 1,000th or less than that, 1 millionth the size of the sun. The sun is very big. So let's see. Yes.
Excuse me, what makes Ganymede the biggest moon in the solar system?
Ganymede is just, we've looked at a lot of moons and we've measured their sizes. And based on all the moons that we see in the solar system, Ganymede is the biggest one. Basically, it's the most kilometers across. It's physically the biggest. And then there's some other moons that are bigger, and of course the planets, which are all bigger than the moons.
Thank you.
Mhm. So Ganymede, and we'll now continue to the last one of the Galilean moons, which is Callisto. Callisto is the furthest from Jupiter and does not really get affected by Jupiter's gravity very much. And it's the third biggest moon in the solar system, after Ganymede, which is the biggest, and Titan, which is one of Saturn's moons. Although we might talk about that at a later time. Since it's very far from Jupiter, it's very, very suitable for landing potential spacecraft on it, which is why in the future, we would choose this moon to eventually land on. As you can see, these colors and the structure in Ganymede, these are actually caused by ice and asteroid impacts that affect it, because while these are the four biggest Jupiter's moons, there's many other moons, and sometimes these moons collide, and that's why there's a lot of craters and, as you can see, destruction on the surface of the moon.
Excuse me, sir.
Yes.
Please, between Ganymede and Callisto, which one is the most biggest moon?
Ganymede is the biggest, followed by Titan and then Callisto. So Callisto is the third biggest moon in our solar system.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
Okay. How many does Callisto have a volcano?
Now, Callisto doesn't have, wait, can you please mute? Callisto doesn't have volcanoes. It's actually, let's see. It's Io. Io that has, can you please mute? It's actually Io that has volcanoes. And these volcanoes are actually the subject of a lot of debate, and people are very interested in them because these eruptions cause Io to have a small atmosphere, almost. Atmosphere is just gases that go around a planet that are pulled in by gravity. And atmospheres can mean that things might be able to live on there, and it's in fact usually warmer than most other things in the solar system, and therefore, since it's warmer, it can maybe be a suitable place, suitable for life. Hannah, do you have a question?
Excuse me, please.
Yes.
Is it the ice that makes this planet crystalline? Like,
Yeah, the other planets like Ganymede and Callisto, it's these ice crystals, but also all of the asteroid impacts that have hit the moon. So there's many different types of rocks in the solar system that are orbiting around the sun and orbiting around other planets. And because of that, there's a lot of asteroid impacts that happen over long periods of years. And this causes, can you please mute? This causes a lot of impacts and creates these kind of crystal structures on the moons.
thank you.
So Ganymede is the biggest moon at answering one of those questions in the chat, but we'll go back to this picture. And as you can see, if you look at the size of Ganymede, it's only slightly bigger than Callisto and Titan. So those are really the three biggest moons in our solar system. And then Europa and Io which are the other two Galileo moons, are slightly smaller. As you can see, Earth's moon, which is the moon, is here to comparison, and then Earth itself, which is still bigger, a lot bigger than the moons.
Excuse me, sir.
Yeah.
Can I ask a question?
Oh, we'll have questions after. Let me just explain one more thing. Okay, so back to lunar eclipses. So lunar eclipses don't always happen on Earth, and they can happen in any planet that you're observing from. But it actually happens on Earth that the moon is about 400 times farther. I mean, the sun is 400 times farther away than the moon, but it's also 400 times bigger, which means that in the sky, the sun and the moon are about the same size, approximately, which means that the sun can fully block, the moon can fully block the sun in the solar system if it aligns correctly, which it does during solar eclipses. And lunar eclipses, because the moon is a lot smaller than the Earth casts a big shadow, which means lunar eclipses are actually a lot more common because there's a lot more alignments that the moon could be in for it to work. So answering the question in the chat, do any
Happy to have a question.
there's a question in the chat.
Please, what's the Galilean?
What's a Galilean moon?
Galilean moons are 4 of Jupiter's moons that were discovered by Galileo Galilei, which was an astronomer who lived 400 years ago and created the first telescope. So he was the first person to discover many of these solar system objects.
Thank you.
These moons, they might have a very small atmospheres, but they're too small to have a really big atmosphere because they don't have enough gravity to pull in all of the air needed to have an atmosphere. However, some of the moons, like the biggest moon, Ganymede, they do have small atmospheres and even magnetic fields, which protect the moon and could be considered small atmospheres. Like, for example, but most planets have much bigger atmospheres than moons because they're just bigger in size and have more gravity. Okay, so we've gone over the Galilean moons. There's also some moons on Saturn, Uranus, Venus, Mars, and even Pluto. And Pluto, as you can see. So we haven't gone through all the moons, but the 4 Galilean moons, which are the 4 moons that Jupiter has, are the most important and the most widely known moons of our solar system, along with Titan and Triton and a couple other than moons. But another notable moon to think about is Charon, which is Pluto's only moon. And Charon is actually pretty big compared to Pluto because Pluto is very small. And that means that these 2 objects, Charon doesn't really go around Pluto, but both Charon and Pluto go around a middle point between them because both their gravities affect each other so much, which is another interesting fact about Charon and Pluto.
Excuse me, sir.
Yes.
Please, how many moons we have in the world?
In the solar system, can you please move it?
In the world.
So in the universe, there are many, many moons because there are many, many stars, which each have their own solar system. And there's many, many galaxies which have a lot of stars in them. So there's actually many moons in the universe, too much to count. And we can't really look at moons outside of the ones in our sun because our telescopes aren't strong enough. So we only know about the moons in our solar system. And we have about 200 moons in our solar system, which is our sun and the 8 planets. So if there's any more questions, thank you for participating. That was all about the moons. Do you have any more questions about moons or how they orbit or work? If you could raise your hands and then I'll answer them now.
Can you please go back to the first topic?
Oh, the first topic, yes.
The first topic.
That was about moon, our moon and moon phases. Wait, can you
Excuse
please-
me, sir.
Yeah,
Excuse me, sir.
yes.
Million moons connected with Earth
Wait.
or other moons that carry the same companies as Jupiter.
Wait, please mute. I'll explain this and then I can answer a question later. So basically, we started this lecture with, for the people who missed it, our moon, and the fact that our moon orbits the sun, or I mean, orbits the Earth once every month, which is where the unit of time month comes from. It's like moonth, almost like moonth, because it's the time it takes the moon to go around the Earth. And in the question chat, there's 8 planets that we in our solar system. So with moon phases, the sun is always lighting up half of the moon because the other half is behind that half. But based on where the moon is around the Earth, different parts of the moon are lit up, as we can see from Earth. When it's a full moon, the entire half that's illuminated by the sun can be seen from Earth. But for example, when there's a half moon, only half of the illuminated part can be seen from Earth, which is why we only see half a moon and the other half is dark. And during a new moon, as you can see in this diagram, the part that is lit up is completely facing away from us. And we only see the dark side, meaning we don't actually see any moon during the new moon phase of the lunar cycle. The cycle repeats once every 28 days or about 1 month, because it takes 1 month for the moon to go around the Earth. And it repeats every time the moon goes around the Earth. As you can see, the names of each phase are listed here down below in this diagram, starting with a new moon, then waxing crescent first quarter, which is a half moon, waxing gibbous, which is this shape, a full moon, then waning crescent third quarter, which is a half moon with the other side, and waning crescent. And we already went over eclipses.
Please, sir.
Yes?
Why do they call a first quarter moon
Why did they what?
first quarter?
Can you please repeat your question?
Why do they call
Why do they call the first quarter moon first quarter?
Because it's a quarter of the way into the lunar cycle. So as you can imagine, you can split the lunar cycle into 4 different quarters. And in the first quarter of the lunar cycle, it's a half moon. Then the second quarter, it's a full moon. Then the fourth quarter, it's another half moon, but it's a third quarter. Full moons appear when the moon is behind the Earth almost, but not directly behind. But as you can see in this diagram, the sun lights up half of the moon, and then we can see the entire half of that moon, and that's when a full moon appears. So that's what I have. If there's any more questions, feel free to ask me. I'll be here. But apart from that, that's all about moons, and that's what we're going to do. In the future, we're going to talk about stars and galaxies in future lessons. And we're also going to go into depth about space exploration and telescopes. So that's what's coming up for the future. If there's any more questions, feel free to continue to ask. And if not, then that's it. You can raise your hand or unmute if you want to ask any more questions.
Excuse me, please.
Yes?
About the galaxy.
Mhm.
What do they call a Milky Way?
So the Milky Way is just the name of our galaxy. So there's many galaxies in the universe, and the name of our galaxy, which is the one our star is in, our solar system is in, is called the Milky Way galaxy. Do another person have a question? Henry, do you have a question?
About stars, how many stars can we see in the solar system?
In our solar system, it's just the sun and 8 planets. So a solar system is centered around one star. So there's only one star in our solar system. And then there's
Excuse me, I didn't hear you. How many stars?
there's one star in our solar system, and there's many solar systems in our galaxy, which is called the Milky Way galaxy. And the one star in our solar system is called the sun, because the sun is a star.
How many stars are there in the universe?
In the universe, there's many billions of stars because there's millions of stars in our galaxy, which is called the Milky Way. And then there's many different galaxies, but we can't count them all because many of them are too far away to see, and many of them just haven't reached our telescopes yet. Does anyone else have a question?
Hi, my name is. Hello. I
Uh,
want to ask a question
Yeah.
about space exploration.
Mhm.
About space exploration, how will we take practical lessons?
In the whole world.
How will we what? Take lessons?
How will we take practical lessons?
So we will learn about past space and future space exploration endeavors. For example, when we sent humans to the moon and when we sent rovers to Mars. Like very recently, we sent the Perseverance rover. Can you please mute? Very recently, we sent the Perseverance rover to Mars, which actually had a drone, like a remote control helicopter on it, which has flying on Mars. And so we'll learn more about those rovers and about human trips to the International Space Station, which are satellites, and to the moon.
Who was, excuse me,
Yes.
do you know the first man who lived on Earth?
There was no first man who lived on Earth because of evolution. Basically, it was slowly evolved as beginning as apes and slowly evolved into humans. So there was no first man or first person.
Excuse me.
Uh,
Please, how many degree of gravity? How many degree of gravity do we have on Earth and in space?
how many what?
Degree of gravity.
So gravity just depends on how big the object is. So the bigger an object is, the more gravity it has. Here on Earth, we have some gravity, and on the moon, since the moon's a lot smaller than the Earth, there's a lot less gravity on the moon, which means you can like jump higher on the moon and stuff like that. The sun is a star, answering the question in the chat. The sun is a star.
Excuse me, how many gravity do you say?
There's no such thing as degree of gravity, but the bigger an object is, the more gravity it will have. Basically, gravity is just how big an object is and how far the objects are apart.
Thank you.
Hannah, do you have a question? You're raising your hand. If no one has any more questions, then
There is one question.
yes.
Okay.
Do you have a question?
How many times does the moon move around Earth?
In a year.
In a year, it
How
moves
many times?
because it moves once every month. So in a year, it'll move around the Earth 12 times because 12 months. Yes, Hannah,
Okay.
do you want to ask a question?
Oh, let's see.
Yes.
Yes.
Since in space there's zero gravity, so here on Earth, how many percent of gravity do we have here on Earth?
So there's no percent of gravity, but here on Earth, we can measure gravity based on how fast things can fall. And on Earth, things accelerate at around 10 meters per second squared, which is basically the acceleration of gravity on Earth. And that's one way that we can measure gravity. On the moon, it's like 1 meter per second squared, meaning it's a lot smaller than 10. And it's about 1/10. So it's only 10% of the gravity on the moon as on the Earth. But you can't measure gravity by percentage. You measure it by either acceleration or by force. The sun is a star. Yes, so stars are basically in space.
Excuse me.
We'll learn about them later, but they're big balls of gas that are constantly burning almost, but not really burning. And the sun is a star. There's many, just like the stars that you see when you look up. Just the sun is much closer. We'll learn about stars in the next.
And what did you say the sun is also a star?
What?
Why did you say the sun is also a star?
Because the way we define stars is basically using the sun as a definition. So stars, if you go close to any of the stars that you see when you look up in the sky, they will look just like the sun. They're just farther away, which means they look smaller in the sky. But stars are just as bright as the sun. So, and they look and are composed of the same materials as the sun, meaning
How do we use telescopes?
telescopes. We'll learn that too in a future lesson, but telescopes just collect light and focus it into a smaller point. And that's the simplified explanation. They're very big, so they can collect a lot of light and they focus it into a very small eyepiece, which means we can see things that are very far away.
This man knows something. Yes, that was
Okay, if that,
how does it feel in space? How does it feel in space? Have you ever traveled to space?
no, I think only 400 people have gone to space, but if you go away from stars and planets in space, there is no gravity. Also, if you go around in orbit, it's basically the people in the ISS and in space stations, they move around the Earth in orbit. And so they feel weightless, even though there's still gravity up there because they're constantly moving very fast.
What do we call the coat we wear to space?
What did he say?
The coat. What do we call the coat we wear to space?
Oh, a spacesuit.
What? Spacesuit.
A spacesuit. Yeah.
Spacesuit.
That's
Thank you.
what astronauts have to wear if they want to go outside in space. But if they're in the space station, they don't actually have to wear a spacesuit because they have air and in the space station.
Is my mom? What? Zoom class.
If there's any more questions, so we'll go into stars, galaxies, and in future lessons. Today we learned about moons, and then we went a bit into
How
stars.
many planets are in the whole
We don't know exactly how many planets there are because planets are very small, and when they're far away, they're very hard to see. But we think that there's many millions of planets because of how many stars there are and how many planets there can be around a star. We call the planets outside of our solar system exoplanets.
Hello.
Yes,
I want to ask a question.
yes.
My question is, how many moons do we have in the space? How many moons do we have in space?
How many moons? So in our solar system, which is just our star, which is just one star, our sun, 200 moons. And moons are very, very small when they're far away, meaning we don't actually know how many moons there are in other planets. We can only assume that there's many, many more moons that we have not found. And answering the question in the chat, force is measured in, it's a unit called newtons, but basically force is just when you push something, you exert a force on it, basically. Nula? No, Nula?
Nothing, sir.
Yes?
Why do the I don't know.
Okay, well, there's another question in chat, but why do astronauts believe there's life beyond the Earth? Well, we don't know it, but because there's so many other planets in the universe and so many other planets that could have water and could be warm, just like Earth, we think that there are many Earth-like planets that we haven't found yet, and that there could be life on those planets, but we don't know yet.
Hello, I have a question.
Yes?
My question is, how many moons does Jupiter have?
Jupiter has around 79 moons, but it is a lot of moons because it's so big. So we think it's around 79, but we keep finding more. The sun is a middle-sized star, answering a question in chat.
Axis takes place with that what
We'll learn more about the sizes of stars and what the middle-sized star and the life cycle of stars in our next lesson, which is going to be all about stars.
Excuse me, I have a question.
Yeah.
Epictetus takes place with what and what?
What did you say?
Earth space takes place with what, and what?
Wait, can you repeat that question? I didn't hear it.
Eclipses.
Oh, wait, eclipses.
Eclipses.
Mhm. So
Take place with what, and what?
eclipses are when the sun, earth, and moon line up correctly, as you can see in this picture here. So either if the moon is in between the sun and the earth, or if the earth is in between the moon and the sun, because the moon is constantly going around the earth. So sometimes these two positions happen. And these are the two different types of eclipses.
Excuse me, sir.
Yes?
Which planet has 67 moons?
Jupiter has 79 moons. It used to have less moons, but we keep finding more and more moons since our telescopes keep getting better and we keep looking. So we're finding more and more moons that Jupiter has. Jupiter has the most moons in our solar system.
Excuse me, sir.
Thing.
What is it? Excuse me, sir. What's a dysnomous?
What's what?
What's a dysnomous?
Can you repeat that?
What is a dysnomous?
I'm not sure what you're saying. A dysnomous?
A dysnomous. Excuse me, sir.
I'm not sure what you mean by that.
She asked, what is a dysnomous?
Do you see that here or?
A dysnomous. Of this thing. Okay.
In chat, plants can't grow on Mars because Mars very cold and has no atmosphere, so it has no water. So plants can't. We think Mars might have used to have water, but right now it's completely dry. Okay, so this lesson will end in 5 minutes if no one has any more questions. Okay, yeah, feel free to go. That's it for today. And tomorrow, and I mean, next week, we'll plan to look more into stars and the life cycle of stars, how stars work, and different types of stars in our solar system. Yeah, see you guys next week.
Okay, sir. Bye.
Bye.
See you next time.
Mhm.
Bye,
See you
sir.
next time.
Bye. Thank you for coming.
Bye, sir.
Bye.
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 Bye. And there's a question in chat about I think 1,000 Jupiters can fit inside the sun. The sun is very big. Well, see you next week. I'm going to end the meeting now.